Um, well, let me kick off by saying what a pleasure it is to have been invited to this conference. What a great conference it's been so far. I think there have been some really wonderful presentations. I've really enjoyed it. It's a particular pleasure for me because I've just finished a 9-year prison sentence running resources and planning at the LSE. That was a 6-day-a-week job, and now going to conferences. It's an absolute relief. I did keep up my research, though, because I persuaded myself if I didn't do research, if I woke up in the night, I'd start worrying about committees, and that's the last thing I wanted to do. So I did bring one slide, and then I thought it's a bit modest, so I wouldn't even bother to put it up. So let me tell you a bit of history, and then we get on to the topic, because really I actually have a very small point to make. So it would have been about 1993. There was what was called the first National Consensus Conference on Plant Biotechnology in London, and I was invited to participate in it because I knew something about genetics, and I had a bit of a training in neuroscience. And it was rather fascinating because it introduced the idea of this new technology, a new what they call base technology, recombinant DNA. This would be genetic engineering of life forms, and there were the usual sort of utopian and dystopian visions accompanying it. And Martin Bauer and I, and I've collaborated with Martin now for 20 or 30 years, we thought, well, you know, this looks like an interesting topic, a challenge to the natural order. How would this new technology come into everyday life, into everyday discourse, common sense? Would there be resistance? Martin Bauer is very keen on resistance to technology. So we scratched our heads, but not very long. We decided that approaching a new technology through the perspective of attitudes wouldn't get us very far, because attitudes are simply rank ordering states of the world and people in terms of preference. So that didn't seem very interesting. I'd done lots of work on risk analysis, and again, that looked a bit restrictive. So we decided to go for social representations. We were fascinated by it. We'd, of course, read the psychanalyse and the idea of representations circulating in different milieux. And we also felt that because, you know, no one would know anything about recombinant DNA, it's not a sort of topic of conversation. How would people get to understand it? Well, we decided the mass media was probably would be the main route by which people would be introduced to the technology. So we did lots of research on forms of resistance. We noticed that there was a sort of Frankensteinian model. This would be a monster that would go out of control, and then there was the Faustian version, scientists creating a pact with the devil and what would come next. We looked at the interesting challenge between the meaning of the life sciences, denotation and connotation. So the scientists can say, it is this, but connotation in the public domain is out of the control of scientists, and this creates interesting differences. We noticed too, from the resistance to biotechnology, challenges to two of the grand narratives of the post-war years. The notion that the market should rule, and the notion that within the market, within the ruling market, science is the ultimate truth, and there are no challenges to it. And we also looked over the years on how people's thinking about modern biotechnology, the life sciences, affected the trajectory of other technologies that came along. And as this program of research evolved, so did our thinking on social representations, and it was thinking that was, you know, a bit of a collective enterprise, because Gerard Duveen was always in and out of London, or we were at Cambridge, or we were meeting Wolfgang Wagner, Nicole Kronberger, had a Marie Curie fellowship at the LSE. Serge periodically came over. And that's how the famous Toblerone model appeared. It was really just a joke, really, because Martin Bauer is Swiss, and I thought that would be a nice way of capturing it, but it turns out it's owned by a ghastly American company. that's changed the shape. So I don't know whether, you know, this is resistance from the chocolate manufacturers to a social psychological theory, but we have to work on that. Actually, just as a sideline, big data may provide a very interesting opportunity to analyze the Toblerone model in reality, because with big data, social network type, social media type data, we can look at not only networks, but we can look at networks over time and evolving representations, evolving structures of meaning. I've yet to find a decent data set to try that out, but maybe one will turn up. So anyway, that's a preliminary, because periodically nice people write to me and say, Professor Gaskell, blah, 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 you know, and they're always very complimentary, and I'm very pleased at that. And they say, I'm going to do a social representation study of X, Y, or Z. What do you think, they say? And I say, well, it's a great idea, but, and let me give you the reason why I say but. First of all, Serge's contribution to the annual review of psychology in 1963. It was called Attitudes and Opinions. And in 1963, a few people were doing research on attitudes, and we've probably forgotten all about it now. But he particularly homes in on opinion research, collecting data on what the public think about X, Y, and Z. And he says, this is entirely bankrupt. It's theoretically bereft. He doesn't say it, but it's the sort of gee whiz Alma. Who would have believed that, you know, such and such a percentage of Americans are still creationists? Well, if you know it, you can be shocked, but there's not much we can do about it. It's not really of any significance. So he is unequivocal in his critique of opinion research. And then we had because I worked with Hilda, well, I was in Hilda Himmelweit's department at the LSE, and Hilda was a great one for setting up conferences. And she was always very worried that Serge and Henri Tajfel had fallen out, and she wanted to engineer a rapprochement. Anyway, we had a meeting in a nice place in Germany, Bad Homburg, and that was the meeting that created the book Societal Psychology. And it was a very interesting discussion there, because Serge's view of societal psychology went something like this. That the parent discipline is psychology. Social psychology is the progeny, really, in that, you know, lots of the ideas from mainstream psychology came into social psychology, experimentation, the focus on the individual, and so forth. But he also noted that lots of other social scientific disciplines invent their own version of social psychology. So the historians, and particularly the French historians, the analystes, have this concept of mentality. I was going to comment to the speaker this morning talking about history. I think the analystes are very interesting to look at, and also, what's his name, Norbert Elias, the civilizing process. So Serge says, hang on, the social sciences are developing their own versions of social psychology, and they have no knowledge of what's going on in what we call social psychology. And he said, well, we've got a problem here. If we don't reach out, if we don't speak to these other sub-disciplines of social psychology, we will, you know, lose influence. But equally, he was keen to suggest that these other areas in the social sciences, whether it's sociology, whether it's management, whether it's geography and environment, worrying about ecology and so forth, if we don't take on some of their interests, we will lose substantive areas. And we're seeing this today at the LSE. A number of my colleagues in economics are doing work on group polarization. And when I ask them, have you heard of any of the work in social psychology? Of course they haven't. And they're really quite surprised that psychologists might have looked at this. So on the basis of this, when somebody asks me, you know, I'm going to do social representations of X, I say, well, you know, that's a brilliant idea, but remember that description is a means to an end, not an end in itself. The what question, what's happening here, is a great starting point. And it's very important. I'm a great believer in qualitative research, complementing quantitative research and vice versa. And qualitative research, whatever, finding out what's happening, an analytic description is very important, but it shouldn't stop there. We have to go from the what questions to the why questions, to the how questions. And when we ask a why question, we say, if we've got some answer to it, because. And because is the first step in some sort of an explanation. And when we're thinking about social representations, we may be wanting to know how they've come about, how they differ in different milieus and why that might be the case. What is the link between particular representations and choice, action, and decisions? Do these have implications for communication, etc.? So all the interesting substantive areas that are problematic in contemporary society, we should be looking at. And my view, as I said, in a somewhat noisy interjection in the last session, is that we don't approach, we may approach them through the perspective of social representations because we think this gives us a set of analytic concepts. It gives us the freedom to use a variety of methods, to pick methods to suit the problem rather than say, oh, I'm an experimentalist. If the world doesn't fit into an experiment, I'm not interested in the world. So social representations, I think, has developed into a very, quotes unquotes, well conceptualized process with a Catholic approach to the way in which we do research, and that appeals to me. So I say to these people, okay, do the what question, but please think about where you take it. What next? Why is the next question to ask? And if we're studying challenges in the real world, then, as I tried to articulate in that handbook of social representations with one of my PhD students, the Coleman's boat, the link between macro and micro levels, the idea of contextual mechanisms which link the macro to how people experience the world, and the transformation mechanisms, how minority collective action and so forth can transform the macro level. That seems to me to be another way of thinking about the process of research, thinking about if we go beyond the what questions and the why questions and the pursuit of explanation. So that's what I wanted to say. But I have to say, having invented this as a problem, it seemed to me in this audience, people are pursuing some very interesting conceptual why-type questions. So I think what I would recommend is that when we talk to our PhD students, we encourage them to be a bit more ambitious. Maybe the first chapter of the PhD is the what question, but the rest should be looking at processes and answering whys. Thank you very much.